Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. This is part 2 in our series on understanding transgenderism. So if you missed the first part, please check that out first. There is a link in the description below. But if you're all caught up, then let's just get into it. The big question we're getting into today is, well, what does it mean? What does transgenderism mean? What does it mean to be transgender? And of course, you can tell from the word, trans meaning change, gender meaning gender, which we'll talk about in a minute. But basically, it is somebody who is biologically male, who self-identifies as a female, or someone who is biologically female who self-identifies as a male. Or alternatively, somebody who identifies as something other than male and female, non-binary, two-spirit, and roughly 7 billion other constantly changing categories. But when it gets down to it, the most essential point is, it's basically a boy who thinks he's a girl, or a girl who thinks she's a boy. And, people are naturally asking, well, why on earth is there any kind of enormous controversy over something like this? This is something that almost everyone who's ever lived on this planet until the past 30 years or so would say is crazy. So how did this suddenly seem reasonable to people? And the key concept that's used for this, to that end, is the distinction between gender on one hand and sex on the other. And just as a note here, the concepts at work in this philosophy are constantly changing. This is a very new thing, and new things are always evolving very quickly. So what I'm about to tell you is actually slightly behind the curve in terms of the way a lot of people will think about it today. But we have to start somewhere, and I think this is the best place to do it. And we'll get up to date as well by the end of this video. So we'll just up to date as I can manage. So we talk about sex. Sex is referring to biological sex, that we are male and female. And is the way that we humans, as living organisms, are configured for reproduction. So sex is pretty straightforward. In humans, if you're looking at genetics, it's a matter of, do you have an XX chromosome or an XY chromosomes? And that's what make us either male or female. And yeah, there are some genetic disorders in which a person will have something other than XX or XY. Usually there's a third X or a third Y chromosome on there. But a lot of people bring that up, but it's really kind of a red herring when it comes to transgenderism. Because, first of all, these genetic disorders are very rare. And second, the people with these disorders don't generally identify as transgender, at least as I understand it. They're actually less likely than the general population to do so. So it's not really germane to the discussion. And of course, in the days before genetics, male or female would be a matter of the easily observable primary sex characteristics of men and women. And yeah, there are rare deformities that can make those hard to judge. But again, kind of a red herring when it comes to this particular issue. If your hand is deformed to look more like a flipper, well, that doesn't mean that you're part seal, right? It's still a hand. It's just a deformed hand. And the same thing goes for primary sex characteristics. There's a very clear reason that we classify these things as disorders or deformities in the first place. And it's because the biological purpose and function of having two sexes is to reproduce. Most intersex conditions severely inhibit reproduction in one way or another. Sometimes that's due to outright sterility, and sometimes it's just, there are practical barriers or impediments to actually reproducing. But at its core, it's the same kind of logic where we say that inborn heart defects are considered defects. The heart's purpose is to pump blood. And so conditions, even naturally occurring, even inborn conditions that inhibit the fulfillment of that purpose are considered disorders. And it is the same thing with biological sex when it comes to reproduction. That's its purpose. That's why we're male and female in the first place, biologically speaking at least. And so biological sex, when you're talking about that is an objective and observable physical characteristic of human beings, with variation only existing in extremely rare disorders. Gender, on the other hand, gender is different, and it is a much, much more fluid term than biological sex is. So to take a brief look at the history of gender here, It's a lot more recent than you might think. The concept of gender, at least as applicable to human beings, did not exist until 1955. Sexologist John Money borrowed a term from linguistics, and he used it for this new concept in the study of human sexuality. And it was meant to help categorize the social expressions of biological sex. Okay, so how biological males behave or appear in a way that is recognized as masculine by society, or the way that women, biological females, behave or appear in a way that is recognized as feminine by society. So gender, this new term that he used, thereby became this go-to label for what is essentially a bundle of stereotypes that are associated with and proceeding from biological sex in a culture. For example, you could talk about men and women having different roles in the home and in society, right? Men go to work and earn money while women stay home and they tend to the children. Those would be examples of stereotypes, gender roles. Or differences in patterns of speech. It's not ladylike to curse. Or different patterns of fashion. You go to a formal setting, men wear tuxedos, whereas women will wear gowns. And just innumerable other touchstones for men and women in a society, in a culture. And so, a bundle of stereotypes associated with biological sex. And now the word stereotype, that does have a bad connotation in our language today. We usually associate stereotype with prejudice. But it's not, doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Stereotypes are not inherently bad. On the contrary, when you have a complex society, you cannot atomize everybody into individuals. We can't even really imagine 350 million fully formed individuals. Recognizing the number, we know we can count them, but in our minds, we can't fully grasp fully realized people on that scale. So when you're talking about society in that way, we speak in terms of generalizations and stereotypes, which can be extremely helpful and even necessary, so long as they're relatively accurate. You can have entirely false stereotypes or mostly false stereotypes, and B, that you remember that there are exceptions to these, and that being an exception is not necessarily a bad thing. And that's very often the tough part. For example, in general, as a generalization, men are taller than women. Very clear generalization. But it's not exactly uncommon for there to be exceptions to that. I went to my wife's high school reunion recently, and we had a waitress there who was a good 4 inches taller than me. And I'm 6'2", so that's pretty unusual for a woman. But there's nothing wrong with it. Right? There's nothing wrong with her being that tall. And there's also nothing wrong with me noting that, it's unusual for women to be that tall. It is what it is. So, in general, in any society, men and women are going to behave differently. They're going to be seen differently. And there are patterns to these differences. And because many of those differences are rooted back in that objective biological sex, in sex differences. When, for example, one sex is generally much larger and stronger than the other, the kind of household labor that they take on, that's going to look very different. When one sex is equipped to bear children and to nourish them from her own body, that kind of household labor that they take on is going to look different. And you could go on and on with examples here, but I think we get the point. So proceeding from that, cultures develop different expectations, and there are patterns to these differences as well. In other words, different cultures will react to those sex differences, but they will react in different ways, right? Each culture is going to look at men slightly different. American man versus a African man or a French man or what have you. There's going to be slight differences in how men are conceived in those different cultures or perceived in those different cultures. But every culture is going to react to the biological differences. And because the differences themselves are similar across different cultures, then a lot of the reactions are going to end up being fairly similar as well. So gender is what Dr. Money chose as his conceptual tool for understanding and cataloging these kinds of differences and similarities in the cultural expressions of biological sex. And it caught on. The term became a very popular one. Feminists in particular, they really bought into this concept of gender as it was a useful way of highlighting what they believe are unfair social restrictions designed by men to oppress women. They found a lot of these different expectations and these different ideas of normal for men and women to be confining for women. Because why on earth would anybody actually want to create life, to make new human beings, when you could be doing something much more fulfilling, like, sitting in a cubicle and making PowerPoint presentations. But in any case, they claimed that these differences favored men over women and culturally enriched men at the expense of women. And so gender was a sociological concept that they could use to help promulgate those ideas. It was a very effective rhetorical vehicle for their ideas. It gave them a certain focus, basically, to change gender stereotypes to be what they considered, at least, to be better for women. And naturally, in subsequent years, people began to realize the blatantly obvious fact that gender stereotypes are actually pretty fluid, mainly because stereotypes in general are very fluid. Generalizations tend to be pretty fluid. After all, some cultures have different stereotypes than others. And even stereotypes in the same culture will change over time. What's expected of men today is very different than what's expected of men 100 years ago, or at least there are significant differences there. Also, everywhere you look in any society, you are going to find people who do not conform to some, or many, or most of the stereotypes that are associated with their biological sex. Most people are going to depart from at least some stereotypes, and some people are going to depart from most stereotypes. So the idea of gender, it became recognized as very fluid. There's nothing necessarily fundamental or foundational or even necessarily objective about it. It can be changed according to the needs of the culture, and has changed according to the needs of different cultures. And again, this transformation was adopted and stressed by feminists in particular, as establishing a fluidity of this sort would make it much easier for them to change what they considered to be repressive social norms. And the fact that they started changing these, that in turn made the norms themselves more fluid. They were, in effect, trying to deliberately tear down our cultural expressions of biological sex for the sake of their political ideologies. And so what we end up with is kind of having this vicious cycle at work. These things are fluid, so we can change them if we want to. And every time we change them, it makes them more fluid, which means we can change them even more, and so on and so forth. And we've had radical changes going on in Western cultures over the past few generations. And lost in the shuffle of all that, of course, was not a whole lot of studying about the connection to biology, because a lot of scholars were far more interested in studying how society influences the stereotypes rather than how actual biological sex would influence the stereotypes, particularly when all this gets mixed up with critical theory, which is very dominant in Western universities, where literally everything is a matter of power structures in a society that a culture is arbitrarily enforcing. They're imposing their will on everybody else. Everything is kind of filtered through that lens in critical theory and its various offspring, like feminism and Marxism and so forth. And this is where you get into the idea of gender being a social construct. And that always has an unspoken merely in that sense. Gender is merely a social construct, which is highly, highly misleading. It is a social construct, but there's a lot more meaning to it than that. So as this new concept of gender evolved, it became more and more distanced from any of its original anchoring in objective science, in observable biological sex, and moved further and further away from biology. And today, of course, this recognition of fluidity has been it's emphasized to truly extreme degrees. some people are asking, how can we even think in terms of these two genders, male and female, if these stereotypes are so fluid and inconsistent? What do you do with your concept of gender when you have no objective anchoring for it anymore? And people react to that in a whole lot of different ways. Some people will choose to swap genders, to adopt what they see as the opposite gender, which is somehow more true to themselves or more true to their personalities, in their opinion. Other people, they've multiplied the number of genders by orders of magnitude beyond the original two. So they have all those non-binary options in the mix as well that have cropped up in the last decade or so. Others, they've gone so far as to assert that there is no real difference between masculinity and femininity, and gender is nonsense, and just abolish the original two genders altogether for all practical purposes. But whichever way you go on that question, whichever way you react, the big push now is to finish entirely disassociating sex and gender from each other. And this is where we're finally starting to get out from, get a little bit more up to date here. Basically, the idea is that asserting that being feminine has nothing to do with being biologically female, and being masculine has nothing to do with being biologically male, or at least nothing definitive about it. So, as part of that, what we're seeing now is people attaching all the sexual reference in our language, he, she, man, woman, etc., and they're attaching those words to gender instead of sex, and deliberately leaving biological sex in this kind of linguistic no man's land where we have no words left, or at least no colloquial words left to really refer to that. So now when you say that man over there, you might think that you mean that biologically male person, but no, I mean that is what the word's meant for centuries. The word she has been part of a standard part of the English language for 500 years, and the word he has been part of it for 700 years. Whereas gender, 60 years old, right? So that's the thing. None of those words refer to gender. They never did. The referent, the meaning of the words, has always been a matter of biological sex. Now, to be sure, the fact that the words exist, that is a consequence of gender, at least as originally conceived, because society developed these different words as social expressions of biological sex. But the words themselves, they are referring back to biological sex. But now, when you say that man over there, the only thing you're really allowed to mean is that person who identifies with the male gender. And so yeah, you're trying to get all reference to sex, biological sex, removed from those words. It's a highly anachronistic application of postmodern concepts to pre-modern language. It's really a weird sleight of hand. But after they start doing that, they don't really have any words left over for biology, and deliberately so. There is an intentional move away from objectivity in this matter, and because biological sex is very objective, you can't have objectivity messing up what you want to do with these words. And the argument for this is basically that biological sex has now been recognized as a meaningless concept, and we don't need words to refer to biological sex anymore, which is absolutely absurd. I mean, for one thing, humans are the only creatures for whom people make this argument. No biologists are claiming that biological sex is meaningless for penguins or for antelope or anything like that. And for another, the continued existence of the human race kind of depends on the existence of biological sex and on our ability to recognize biological sex. If men and women can't find each other or recognize each other, well, then it's going to be a whole lot harder to have babies. And to a large extent, the fact that our culture has this very selfish hatred of children and family that we've developed over the past couple generations, that's really what's allowed these ideas to take root. Because once you take the attitude of, I don't want kids, they're messy, they're noisy, they're irritating. Well then, once you take that attitude, biological sex, that suddenly becomes less important to you, right? And you're less likely to recognize disorders of sexuality as disorders because you fail to acknowledge the designed purpose of biological sex in the first place. But once you jettison biology, once you start removing that from our language, gender starts being portrayed as the firmer foundational concept, while sex becomes fluid and ephemeral, and we can't really, and highly subjective. So, in other words, a lot of people have begun looking at biological sex as just another gender stereotype. They would see phrases like, most men like football, but some men prefer ballet. They would see that to be basically equivalent to saying most men have penises, but some men have vaginas. They would see those as two generalizations. So whereas gender used to proceed from biological sex, that's what it was designed for in the first place, they flipped it around so that sex is now proceeding from gender, and biology is excluded from the conversation altogether, or at least it's excluded as having any kind of definitive role in the conversation. And I've seen trans folks who make the argument that even paying attention to biological sex is basically just asking people what their genitalia look like. And therefore, it's super creepy. It's weird if somebody's asking about biological sex. That's just weird. Which is a contradiction, by the way. You can't say that biological sex it's completely irrelevant and insignificant and meaningless, but it's also private and personal and meaningful to the point that intrusion on that privacy is creepy. Right? You can't have it both ways. If biological sex really is completely superficial and meaningless, then asking what a person's genitalia looks like, well, it wouldn't be any different than asking where they bought their shirt. But that's the thing. The activist, she knew that it's very, very different from asking where she bought her shirt. Meaning that she does know that her biology is highly relevant. She's just pretending otherwise for the sake of rhetoric in the argument. And a lot of people fall for that rhetoric. But disregarding biology in the whole conversation, it's a very, very anti-scientific approach to take on this whole issue. First, because biology was really the only wholly objective element in this whole mix. And second, if gender is disassociated from biological sex, then the concept of gender, it has utterly failed at the purpose for which it was invented, which was precisely to describe the various social structures associated with biological males and females. That's why it was invented in the first place. In other words, by excluding biology from gender, well, this recently invented notion of gender has now become a scientifically useless concept. It categorizes nothing. It describes nothing. It conceptualizes nothing. The only use it has is for certain political and ideological reasons, and for subjective matters of personal identity. So what we have is that gender itself, whereas it used to be this outward expression of biological sex, has been turned inward. Not a social expression of sex that other people might or might not recognize, but as this internal and subjective sense of self-identity to which the rest of society must be made to submit. After all, without being anchored in biological sex, there's nothing objective that can be expressed. It's only personality. It's only this idea of self-personal identity. And it all becomes a matter of personal experience, and it deliberately eliminates any space for interpretation of that experience. And, to progressives, of course, this brief history of gender is necessarily a brief history of progress. By their reckoning, people used to think that there were male and female humans, but now science has advanced to the point where we realize that this distinction, which is so fundamental not only to human history and civilization, but also to continued human existence, well, it was all just an illusion all along. And we're finally smart enough to realize that we're so much wiser than those rubes back in the past ever were. And so that's a quick history of the philosophy behind transgenderism. And that is where we're going to pause for now. But we are going to pick up where we left off next week, because this philosophy, it is one that sets itself up in opposition to Christianity. And we still need to talk about that. So like, comment, subscribe, etc., all that business. And join us next time when we consider why transgender philosophy is not compatible with the teachings of Jesus Christ in the Bible.